The reign of Cardinal D Henrique lasted only 1 year and 5 months, from August 28, 1578, the date on which he was acclaimed king, until January 31, 1580, the date of his death. D. Henrique ascended the throne at the age of 66 in a very unfavorable situation. The kingdom had reached a point of great crisis, both economically and financially, as well as politically, which has generally been assessed as a kind of interregnum. D. Henrique came to power precisely when his political strength had entered a decline. In fact, the situation in 1578 had nothing to do with the period of the regency during the minority of de Sebastião, 1557 to 1568, when D. Henrique could impose himself from the point of view of the regency. D. Catarina, assuming the government of the kingdom in the decisive phase of 1562 to 1568, influenced the choice of the first servants of D. Sebastião in 1568 a 1569, Miguel de Moura, Martim Gonçalves da Câmara, Dom Martinho Pereira. In this period, Dom Henrique attempted to accumulate the greatest possible number of posts: prior of the monastery of Santa Cruz de Coimbra, 1526, administrator of the Archbishopric of Braga, 1533, Inquisitor-General, 1539, Archbishop of Evora, 1540, administrator of the monastery of Alcobaça, 1542, Cardinal, 1545, Legate of the Holy See, 1553, Archbishop of Lisbon, 1564. He thus secured control of a large portion of the ecclesiastical patronage network, particularly within the church itself. During the regency, D. Henrique took decisive steps to restructure and enlarge the sphere of influence, reorganization of the Council of State with regular establishment and functioning, reform of the Casa da Índia, the Mesa da Consciência e da Fazenda, revenues from the dioceses, reform of the religious and military orders, assistance for the construction of churches, development of military fortifications in the kingdom and overseas, organization of the university, building of colleges by the Society of Jesus. D. Henrique's power, over 2 generations, began to suffer a strong erosion from the mid-16th century. D. Sebastião's government, practically uninterrupted from 1568 to 1574, built its own sphere of power and influence, which in turn sought to distance itself from the regency of D. Catarina, as well as from D. Henrique's influence and his people. The journey to Africa in 1574, carried out against D. Henrique's opinion, is the most striking example of that distancing. Thus, having recovered Pero de Alcácer Carneiro, who had been dismissed in 1576 from the position of Secretary of State, D. Sebastião removed from the service of D. Henrique those who were closest to him. For example, D. Francisco Portugal was appointed Secretary of State in 1569 to replace Francisco de Sá de Meneses, the last man of Manuel's era. New corregedores, chief magistrates, were appointed: Belchior de Amaral, Diogo da Fonseca, Francisco Soares. In the Council of State, we find Cristóvão de Távora and D. Jorge da Silva. From the previous period, only Miguel de Moura, who had been Secretary of State since 1564, and Francisco de Sá de Meneses remained. When D. Henrique was acclaimed king, he immediately focused his action on the responsibility for D. Sebastião's expedition in 1578. The return to Lisbon of the survivors of Alcácer Quibir raised accusations of cowardice in the recruitment of troops, for example against Luís da Silva, who was accused of treason, 15th January 1579. In the cases of Alcácer Carneiro and Luís da Silva, the accusations, however serious, were quashed by the king himself. But the trials initiated against the lesser figures clearly show the direction of the government, imposed especially in the debate over the importance of the royal household and the distribution of posts at court. Rui de Matos de Noronha, who would later be appointed by Dei Henrique as regidor of the Casa da Suplicação. Domingos Borges, Francisco de Faro e Mor, sellers of rents in the treasury. Dei Jorge de Ataide, Bishop of Viseu, who resigned his bishopric to be appointed to the state secretariat. He was not obliged to resign in order to go to India as viceroy. The Cardinal King's government replaced Luis de Ataide, appointed as Secretary of State, always considered a man of confidence, with Miguel de Moura as the leading figure, Secretary of State since 1564 and also Chamberlain Major, and D. Duarte de Castelo Branco as Councillor. The Council of State remained a heterogeneous body where problems were discussed, and it sought a balanced composition of different currents, which practically monopolized power, as in the time of Martim Gonçalves da Câmara, proposed by D. Sebastião in 1576. However, with the death of D. Jorge de Almeida, Cardinal in 1574, and later of the confessor of the King of Lisbon, Ataide, Miguel de Moura and Henrique Henriques became dominant figures. João Mascarenhas, Father Leão Henriques, Miguel de Moura, and Francisco de Sá de Menezes. The imprisonment of those alleged to be responsible for the bad outcome of the African expedition was followed by the recovery of royal finances, the reimbursement of loans taken from monasteries and convents, the end of the forced subsidy for the maintenance of troops, the release of Christian captives. At least 250,000 cruzados were paid for their release, and the sale of royal assets in exchange for important loans clearly showed a significant rupture. It is evident that these measures demonstrated in an expressive way the break with the previous policy, corresponding to some of its key ideas, the revocation of monopolies and the safeguarding of salt production. At the same time, it prepared the gradual privatization of royal property with the sale of assets. But the most important aspect of the reforms lay in the effort to restore financial order and to create some breathing space for a kingdom shaken by the loss of an army and the uncertainty regarding the succession to the throne. Ransom of captives. After the Battle of Alcácer Quibir, a true wave of mourning and despair spread across the country. News of the event circulated quickly, producing the first chronicled accounts. The need to ransom prisoners led to a vast mobilization of resources, the holy captivity funds, collection of alms and special taxes in the dioceses, and the action of the Trinitarians and Mercedarians, the religious orders dedicated to the redemption of captives. Large fundraising campaigns were organized, and negotiations were entrusted to the governor of the Algarve, Don Francisco de Costa, even though by 1586 years later, of the 17,000 who had been captured, about half were still missing or unaccounted for. To finance these measures, a program was also undertaken for the liberation of Christian slaves. The ransom of the captives was kept firmly under the control of D. Henrique, even though he could not avoid the intervention of Philip II, who used this central issue to gain popular sympathy in Portugal after Alcácer Quibir, while at the same time ensuring that the problem of the royal succession would remain open. Antonio Viñuales rightly underlines how this question became one of the principal political concerns of the Cardinal King, transformed into the central problem of his reign, the designation of a successor. D. Henrique, who had no children and who was already very old when he ascended the throne, attempted to obtain from the Pope the dispensation to marry, but in vain. The dispensation was refused on September 24, 1578. With this refusal, the progressive worsening of the succession crisis became evident. From that moment, the kingdom was divided between those who, like D. Catarina, the widow of João III and grandmother of D. Sebastião, supported her grandson D. Ranuccio Farnese, Duke of Parma and grandson of the Infanta Maria, and those who supported Philip II, who claimed the throne as the son of the Infanta D. Isabel, sister of D. Catarina and daughter of Manuel I of Portugal. a third party emerged around D. Antonio, prior of Crato, who claimed descent through the illegitimate branch of the royal house of Braganza, and, finally, D. Manuel, son of the Infante D. Duarte and grandson of Manuel I. In the legal sphere, the debate over the legitimacy of Philip II's claim reached deep roots. 11th February 1580, the final decision was handed down. For the recognition of Philip's rights depended on the fulfillment of the sentences of the inquisitorial judges and their respect. The negotiations attempted by D. Henrique with Rome and Spain ended in failure, and his government was quickly undermined by the influence of Philip II, through the presence in Portugal of emissaries, and through the ability to win over nobles and clergy to his side. The support of D. Caterina and her allies would prove decisive. D. Antonio, whose popularity had grown in the months following Alcácer Quibir, lacked the means and resources to oppose Philip II's growing influence and the forces that supported the monarchs of Spain's kingdoms. Philip II's power thus came to be felt with increasing strength, and when D. Henrique died in January 1580 without having appointed a legitimate successor, the way was opened for Philip's rule. At the same time, Philip II's agents skillfully spread the idea that union with Spain's kingdoms would not end Portuguese autonomy, but would preserve the country's privileges and institutions. The people, tired of war, were sensitive to the call for peace and order. Although some resistance appeared, particularly from D. Antonio and those who later supported the movement for independence that would culminate in 1640, the majority of the nobility and high clergy saw in Philip II's accession the only guarantee of stability and continuity of the monarchy. The accession of Philip II, with the convening of the Cortes for that purpose, was in fact a very short process. D. Henrique's government and the Council of State tried in vain to resist Spanish pressures and to find a Portuguese solution to the succession. The old cardinal, advanced in age and with no possibility of direct descendants, found himself at the center of a struggle for power that the various political groups sought to influence in their own favor. The most active were the Philip party, which supported the rights of Philip II, and the Antonio party, grouped around the Infanta di Caterina and the Prior of Crato. The ability of Philip II's envoys to win over large sectors of the high nobility and of the clergy proved decisive. The example of the Dukes of Braganza and Aveiro, as well as of the Counts of Redondo and Vimioso, shows the quick adherence of the principal aristocratic houses to the cause of the Iberian king. Even among the magistrates and officers of the crown, adherence to Philip II advanced with great speed, especially because of the guarantees of respect for the privileges of the kingdom and the confirmation of posts and offices. The great mercantile bourgeoisie and the financiers of Lisbon also came to favor the Spanish cause, attracted by the prospects of access to the vast markets of Castile and of the Indies. Alongside this movement, D. Antonio attempted to gather support, counting above all on the sympathy of the lower clergy, of some sectors of the small nobility, and of the popular classes of Lisbon and the main towns. His failure, however, became clear after the death of D. Henrique. The absence of a strong and unified leadership, the lack of foreign support, and the rapid military intervention of Spanish forces allied with the pro-Philip Portuguese all contributed to the impossibility of Antonio's rule. The reign of Cardinal D. Henrique is, therefore, a period of intense political activity, surely the most complex and micro-detailed period of all those we know in the long 16th century. Precisely because of the weakness of central power, the threat of invasion, and the emergence of various opposing groups in constant conflict with one another, the councils, when they called for innovative initiatives, namely through the procurators of the Cortes, came to occupy a decisive role. Indeed, the debate surrounding the election of the new king ran through the chronicles, constituting itself as a key topic of the political thinking of the time. In addition to the historical dimension of the dynastic idea, political and ideological problems arose, which led the monarchy to define itself as a specific institution, capable of representing the nation in the first person, independently of the given territorial framework. In other words, the term kingdom, with its specificities of power exercised over a given territory, was gradually replaced by the term nation, dominant in the 18th century, which referred to the new conception of the state. Cardinal D. Henrique's reign marks the beginning of a fundamental turning point, which projected political thought into new horizons, moving beyond the fragile debates of legitimacy and succession. In fact, the rule of Philip did not produce assimilation, since the defense of the Portuguese nation was founded fundamentally on the value of independence, the refusal of incorporation by Castile, and the idea that Castile's power, military and demographic, was not enough to suppress the resilience and identity of Portugal. Cardinal D. Henrique's reign, therefore, must be seen as a decisive moment in the construction of Portuguese political thought, a period of definition of the very idea of nationality, incapable of being perceived by the historiography of his own time, but already clearly identifiable in more recent historiography. The image of D. Henrique was the object of diverging views already during the time in which he lived. The portrait produced by Damião de Gois, to whom D. Henrique himself commissioned the chronicle of King Dom Manuel, is perhaps the most defining. An individual of medium height, vigorous spirit, highly skilled in physical exercises, hunting, riding, jousting, horse games, cavalry, well-versed in Latin, Greek, Hebrew, mathematics, philosophy, theology, and medicine, although weak in hospitality, without the necessary sociability, severe and demanding in his person, austere and temperate, disinterested in wealth and honors, of sound morals, friend of truth, enemy of rumors and intrigues, free in his opinions, and fearless in the exercise of justice. This portrait was later reproduced almost identically in the work of Friar Bernardo da Cruz, and was later implemented in dialogues of various history by Pedro de Maris, which emphasizes the king's commitment to politics, religious reform, and the choices of his ministers. But Pero Roaz Suarez, supporter of De Antonio, accentuated De Henrique's old age and weakness, his inclination toward Philip II, and the indecision that left the kingdom in disarray upon his death, as many pamphlets circulated afterwards. Moreover, the criticisms of D. Henrique were softened by the treatment given to D. Antonio, as in the case of Father Baltazar Telles, and, later, Friar João Mascarenhas, both Jesuits and supporters of the cardinal. Although they explicitly acknowledged the characterization made by Damião de Gois, they tried to mitigate the harshness of the judgment by presenting him as more lenient than others, less inclined to use the rod and punishment, and highlighting four aspects: modesty and respect, especially the distinction he gave to magistrates; liberality, protector of the company, gave audiences in Évora without prior appointment; his wisdom, he organized debates at the table where only the learned could participate, commissioned chronicles from Damião de Gois, Jerónimo Osorio, and Pietro Maffei, and sponsored the publication of numerous books. D. Henrique died practically isolated, limited from the point of view of political action by a play of powers that had completely escaped his control. The Jesuits remained his last support in a relationship of patronage and loyalty that extended even beyond his death in the works of memory composition. Nevertheless, D. Henrique's action over about 40 years of political life had left behind some structural transformations that would endure, namely the establishment of the Holy Office, the creation of the Council of State, and the reorganization of the administration of the Crown and the Church. It is not an exaggeration to judge D. Henrique's reign as decisive in the process of Portugal's institutional reorganization. The general coordination of inquisitorial activity, the composition of tribunals, the centralization of government in its various sectors, the the circulation of information, the division of tasks, the hierarchy of functions, the mechanisms for preparing decisions, this organizational culture, which marked his reign with its own habits and procedures, still helps shed new light on his government.